The bridge had been dying for years. Everyone in Harlow Creek knew it. They said so at the diner on Maple, over coffee that had gone cold. They said so at the hardware store, when the topic drifted from seed prices to infrastructure and back again. The county had sent assessors twice in 3 years, and both times the assessors had filed their reports, and the reports had vanished into the sediment of bureaucratic delay. The Dunmore Street Bridge was 81 years old, wrought iron dressed in a century of rust, and every winter the frost worked its patient, invisible fingers into the joints. Everyone in town crossed it, most of them without thinking. Habit is a powerful thing. It convinces people that because something has been standing, it will go on standing. The county commissioner had mentioned it at a public meeting in October. He'd said the word remediation twice, and budget constraints 4 times, and the meeting had moved on to the proposed dog park on Clover Avenue, which was a more tractable problem. The bridge stood, the frost continued its patient work, the iron continued its slow return to the earth from which it had been extracted. Everyone knew it was dying. They just didn't know which storm would finish it. That storm came on the 14th of January. The house on Birch Lane had good bones, but poor insulation. Ethan Calloway knew this, the way he knew most structural things, not from any formal diagnosis, but from the feel of the place, the way cold air gathered at the baseboards, the subtle flex of the floor joists under weight that had shifted over decades. He had bought the house 4 years ago, with the last of the money that remained after the hospital bills, the funeral, and the quiet dismantling of a life he'd thought was permanent. He'd paid cash for it, which meant he owned something outright. Some nights that was enough. He was 34. He'd been a structural engineer once licensed, credentialed, employed by a firm in Columbus that did infrastructure consulting for municipal contracts. He had known how to read a load-bearing calculation the way other people read a menu. He had known the language of steel and concrete and tensile stress, had spoken it fluently for 8 years before everything stopped. He'd been good at it. Not just technically competent, but genuinely gifted at the part that couldn't be taught. The ability to stand inside a structure and feel what it was telling him, to read the conversation between weight and support that happens constantly and silently in every engineered thing. His supervisor at Greer Halton, a rigorous woman named Patricia Shen, had told him once that he had the rarest quality in their field. He didn't just calculate risk, he understood it the way a sailor understands the sea. She'd said it as a compliment, and he'd taken it as one. That was before the Route 30 overpass report, before the disagreement that was professionally euphemized as a difference in assessment methodology, and that had actually been him telling the firm that they were choosing contract retention over public safety. After that, Patricia had been careful and distant. And 6 months after filing the report, he'd left. Now he ran a snow removal route in winter, and picked up mechanic work when it came. The garage on Foster Street took his labor off the books 3 mornings a week. He drove a '09 pickup with a plow blade mounted to the front and a salt spreader bolted into the bed. His route covered 11 commercial lots and 2 residential addresses. And on a bad storm night, it kept him out until 2 or 3 in the morning. He didn't mind. The work required enough attention to keep his mind occupied, and not so much that it crowded out the things he needed to remember. Lily's lunch preferences, the field trip permission slip, the parent-teacher conference he'd rescheduled twice and had to stop rescheduling. Lily was 8. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's unsettling habit of noticing things that other people let slide past. She was not precocious in the Hollywood sense. She didn't deliver observations beyond her years in complete, well-formed paragraphs. She was simply observant in the quiet, incremental way that some children are. The ones who listen more than they speak and file what they hear in places they return to. On the afternoon of the 14th, she had stood at the kitchen window in her socks, watching the sky go the color of old tin, and said, "Dad, that looks like a mean cloud." Ethan had agreed that it did. He'd made her soup from a can and cornbread from a box mix, and had gotten the pellet stove burning at a solid level before he kissed her forehead and told her he'd be back before she woke up. She had believed him. She always believed him. That fact sat somewhere in his chest, quiet and heavy. Every time he started the truck, he pulled out of the driveway at 9:17. The temperature was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast called for 8 to 12 inches, and the wind had already begun to perform what it promised. The road out of Birch Lane was already white, and the plow blade bit into the first layer with the familiar resistance he had learned to read as precisely as any instrument. He turned up the radio and drove into it. By midnight, Ethan had cleared the Harlow Creek savings lot, both sides of the pharmacy on Route 9, and the loading dock behind the IGA. The storm had given everything it had. The wind came down from the north in hard gusts that made the plow blade shudder and sent the loose surface snow in white sheets across the cleared lots. He was halfway through the auxiliary lot behind Dunmore Street when the plow blade struck something, a chunk of frozen grit that had heaved up through a crack in the asphalt, and he felt the familiar shudder travel up through the wheel column into his palms. He idled for a moment, checking the blade angle. That was when he felt it. Not sound, exactly. More vibration. Low frequency and wrong, like a string struck off pitch. The kind of frequency that doesn't register in the ear as much as in the chest cavity and in the soles of the feet. He had felt that particular wrongness twice before in his engineering life, once during a site inspection of a rail overpass in Akron, and once when he'd been walking a pedestrian bridge during a wind event in 2014. Both times the bridge had been taken out of service within the week. Both times the engineers who'd come after him had confirmed what his body had registered before his mind had caught up. Structural failure, when it's near enough, speaks in a frequency below language. He got out of the truck. The Dunmore Street Bridge was 40 yards north of where he stood. In the blistering dark of the storm he could see its silhouette, the arc of iron truss work against the slightly lighter sky. The old masonry abutments, the single span over the Black Fork Creek bed that ran 12 feet below in ordinary seasons and was now, after 3 days of snowmelt and rain before the freeze, churning high and fast and audible even through the wind. The bridge was vibrating. Not in the way bridges vibrate under traffic. Dunmore had been closed to vehicle traffic since November, a seasonal measure. Wooden sawhorses across both ends, but laterally, in the direction that indicated the horizontal bracing, had finally given up its last pretense of integrity. He understood with the precision of someone who had spent 8 years translating between human ambition and physical law what was happening to that bridge. He understood it the way a doctor understands a failing heart, not abstractly, but in the specific, present, consequential sense. The cast-iron lower cord was contracting and expanding at differential rates in the freeze-thaw cycling of the storm. The anchor bolts on the east abutment were working loose from concrete that had been porous for at least a decade. The lateral bracing connecting the two main trusses had been inadequate to begin with, and was now approaching the moment of complete inadequacy. He should have driven away. He knew that. He told himself that. His daughter was asleep on Birch Lane, and there was no one to take care of her if something happened to him. He was aware of this calculus with the precision of a man who had been running it every day for 3 years. He was already walking toward the bridge when he saw the headlights. They were already past the barrier. One of the wooden sawhorses had been knocked aside, probably hours ago by a plow or a truck that hadn't bothered to replace it, and they were moving slowly, cautiously, the way a driver moves when they know the road is bad but not exactly how bad. A black Mercedes sedan, too elegant for these roads. Too expensive for anyone who lived on this side of Dunmore. It had gotten perhaps a third of the way across the span when Ethan heard the sound that confirmed what his body had already told him. A deep, tectonic crack, metal finding its limit. The bridge lurched downward on the east side. He ran, not because he had decided to run. The decision, if it could be called that, happened below the level of conscious thought, in the same register, where the body knows to pull back from an open flame. He had left his hat in the truck. The cold hit his face like something absolute. A finality in it. The kind of cold that tells you exactly how serious it is about itself. His boots found traction on the road surface, and then lost it, and then found it again. He did not think about Lily. He did not think about anything that could be named. He ran. The east side of the bridge had dropped approximately 18 inches. The Mercedes was tilted at a steep angle, nose down toward the creek. Rear wheels spinning uselessly against the ice-slicked iron deck. Steam or smoke, he couldn't tell which. Possibly both was rising from under the hood where the engine had taken the impact of the front end, hitting the lower railing. The driver's side window was shattered from the violence of that contact. Glass caught the light from somewhere, a distant street lamp, or the car's own interior light, and scattered it. He reached the driver's door at a run, and checked his stride only at the last moment, because the deck beneath him was angled now, and moving in the micro-tremors of a structure shedding its last load capacity. The woman inside was conscious, barely. She was wearing a charcoal wool coat, expensive, with a wide collar that had done nothing to protect her when her head had met the side window. A cut along her temple had bled down the side of her face, and the blood had gone dark and cold against her pale skin. Her hands were still on the wheel. They were gripping it with the focused, purposeless strength of someone whose hands have found an anchor and are refusing to let go regardless of whether the anchor is helping. "Hey," Ethan said. "Hey, look at me." Her eyes moved. Found him. They were gray and light and very present, which was the important thing. "I'm going to get you out. Don't fight me. Just go loose." The door handle was jammed from the frame deformation where the car had folded against the railing. He gave it 2 hard pulls and felt it give on the second, with the particular reluctance of bent steel yielding. The interior light came on, weak and yellow. She made a sound when the door opened, pain, cold, or the specific distress of someone realizing how much danger they are still in. She was awake enough to be afraid, which he counted as better than the alternative. He got his arms under hers and pulled. She was lighter than he expected. The bridge shook under him as he moved a slow, rolling shudder, organic in its wrongness, like a living thing in its final exhaustion, and he could hear the creak below, loud and dark, and very close now, with the east end dropped so far. He didn't look down. Looking down was not useful information. 20 feet from the road. 15. The surface of the deck was sheeting with water from the melting snow and ice. The grate against him, and his boots found purchase in the old iron grating where it remained, and found nothing where it had gone smooth with decades of rust. He moved anyway. The calculation was simple. He had perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps 20, before the east anchor gave its final measure. He was 10 feet from the road surface when the second crack came. Louder this time, the kind of sound that preceded finality. Not a warning, but an announcement. He ran the last 10 feet carrying her, his boots finding nothing, and then something, and then nothing again, the road surface appearing under them with the abruptness of a sentence ending. He didn't stop running until they were 30 yards clear of the deck, until his legs simply stopped because they had no further instructions, and he set her down against the base of the guardrail on the north side, and sat beside her, in the deep snow. Behind them, the Dunmore Street Bridge finished its long, slow dying. The sound was enormous, a cascade of metal and masonry that compressed itself into 3 seconds, and then was gone, and there was only the creek below, and the wind above, and the absolute winter silence that followed catastrophe, when no one is left inside it. He sat in the snow and breathed. He got her to the truck. It was a 50-yard walk across broken ground in driving snow, and she made it under her own power. Mostly, leaning against him and taking it in increments, the way someone moves when they are not entirely certain all of their body's components are cooperating. Her breathing was steady. Her grip on his arm was firm. She stumbled twice and caught herself both times, which told him something about her. He turned the heat to maximum and found a work blanket behind the seat, wool and smelling of salt and machine oil. The kind of blanket that had been in that truck for years and had no ambitions beyond basic warmth. He wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't object. She sat in the passenger seat, with both hands folded in her lap, watching the snow falling through the windshield, with an expression he recognized, not shock, exactly, but the specific stillness that follows a moment too large to immediately process. The brain receives the information and sets it to the side, a message marked to be opened when conditions permit. "Do you have a phone?" he asked. She looked at him. Her eyes were gray, very light. The kind of gray that reads differently in different light. "It was in my bag," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "In the car. All right." He used his own. He gave the dispatcher the location and a brief account, and listened to the professional calm on the other end, routing the call. ETA, 12 to 15 minutes. The storm had everything backed up across the county. 12 minutes was fine. She didn't need immediate intervention. The cut was a surface wound. Her pupils tracked correctly when he checked with the flashlight from the glove box, and she was coherent. He'd seen head injuries enough times, working construction sites through his 20s, to know the difference between concerning and serious. "What's your name?" he asked. She glanced at him. "Claire," she said. "I'm Ethan." "You're going to be fine. Paramedics are coming." "The bridge," she said. "Don't think about the bridge right now. It's gone." Yes. She absorbed this, looked out at the snow. "I didn't see the barrier," she said. "There was no barrier. I was following the GPS and I turned onto Dunmore and there was no barrier and the road just looked like a road. One of the sawhorses was missing." He kept his voice neutral. "It happens in a bad storm." She nodded once. A small, precise movement. And looked back at the windshield. He stayed until the first flashing lights appeared at the bend on Route 9, and then he got out of the truck and flagged them in. He gave the paramedics a clear, brief account mechanism of injury. Current status, likely concussion, the laceration on the left temple in the efficient shorthand of someone who has worked enough job sites to have learned how to hand off information cleanly. They took over with the smooth, practiced competence of people who do this for a living. He retrieved her key fob from where it had fallen near the guardrail on the bridge approach, set it on the hood of the ambulance where it would be found, and walked back to his truck. He was home by 2:15. Lily was asleep. The pellet stove had maintained. He stood in the kitchen for a while, drinking water from the tap, listening to the wind continue its work at the eaves, feeling the adrenaline complete its long recession. Then he went to bed. He did not think of himself as having done anything particularly notable. He had seen a problem he was equipped to solve. He had solved it. The logic of it seemed, to him, straightforward. He heard about the bridge collapse the next morning from his neighbor, Dennis Varlow, who came to the door at 8:30 with a look on his face that meant he had information and had been waiting for a decent hour to deliver it. Dennis was 63 and had lived on Birch Lane longer than anyone else on the block and regarded himself as its informal chronicler. "Dunmore went down," Dennis said, stamping snow off his boots on the porch. "Whole east span. They're saying a car went with it. No, wait. A car almost went with it. Somebody pulled the driver out first." Ethan poured him a cup of coffee. "Nobody knows who did it," Dennis continued. "Drivers at Regional with a head laceration. Paramedics said someone called it in and left. Heck of a thing." He paused. "You were out last night on your route." "Yep." Dennis looked at him steadily. "Route. Go near Dunmore?" "It can," Ethan said. Dennis drank his coffee. He was, to his credit, a man who knew when not to push. Lily ate her breakfast and went to school. Ethan replaced the bed liner in the truck and did 2 hours of mechanic work on a Silverado at the garage and came home at noon to find that his street had become briefly unfamiliar. There were 3 of them. Black Chevrolet Suburbans with tinted windows, parked at intervals along Birch Lane in the particular way that suggested they had arrived together and arranged themselves with purpose. 2 men in overcoats stood near the first vehicle. They were the kind of men who stood still very convincingly. His first thought was that he had done something wrong. This was not a rational response. He had pulled a stranger from a sinking car, which was by most metrics a defensible action. But rationality has limited authority over the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system took one look at those 3 black vehicles and produced a cold pulse of unease that started in his sternum and moved outward. He parked. He got out. One of the men in overcoats approached him. "Mr. Calloway," the man said. "Not a question." "Yeah. Miss Whitmore would like to speak with you." He didn't know who Miss Whitmore was. He said so. The man nodded as though this was entirely expected. "She's in the vehicle," he said. "She'd appreciate 5 minutes." Ethan looked at the Suburban. Then he looked at his house. Then he looked at the man, who was perhaps 40, who had the posture of someone trained to occupy space without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. "All right," Ethan said. She was sitting in the rear seat of the middle vehicle. The cut on her temple had been properly dressed, A neat row of steri strips, clean and professional, slightly incongruous against the composed precision of the rest of her. She was in her late 30s, he guessed. Her hair was dark and worn simply. She had on a different coat than last night, this one a deep charcoal with clean lines, and her hands were folded in her lap, exactly as they had been in his truck, which struck him as characteristic, a person who defaulted to stillness under pressure. She looked at him when he got in. Her gray eyes were clearer in daylight than they'd been in the storm. The kind of clear that comes with intelligence, worn so long it becomes inseparable from the expression. "You left," she said. "Paramedics had you. You left before I could get your name. The dispatcher had it." She studied him for a moment. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to make easy." She seemed to consider that. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky over Birch Lane was the pale, exhausted white of a storm that had spent itself. "My name is Claire Whitmore," she said. "I run a company called Whitmore Capital Group. We manage infrastructure, investment funds, municipal bonds, development financing, that kind of work. Our regional office is in Columbus." She paused. "Last night, I was driving back from a meeting in Youngstown. I took a wrong turn in the storm. I was following my GPS and it took me down Dunmore." Another pause, shorter. "I owe you my life, Mr. Calloway." Ethan looked out the window at his house. The siding needed painting. He'd been aware of this since August. "You owe me a cup of coffee at most," he said. It was the right thing to do. The bridge was failing. "Yes, you knew that." He didn't answer. She leaned forward slightly. "I've been told that what you did reading the structural failure in real time, navigating a collapsing span under those conditions required a very specific kind of knowledge. Not civilian knowledge." She let that sit. "I had someone look you up this morning, Mr. Calloway. I hope that doesn't bother you." It did. Mildly. He said nothing. Ethan James Calloway. Licensed structural engineer, Ohio registration, lapsed. 8 years, with Greer Halton Infrastructure Consulting. You led the inspection team on the Route 30 rail overpass project in 2018. You were involved in the Milford Pedestrian Bridge Assessment in 2019. The one that prevented a collapse that could have... She stopped herself. "You know your record." He knew his record. "I also know that your wife died in 2021, she said. Her voice had shifted, still precise, but quieter. "I'm sorry." The word landed the way it always did, sincerely meant. Inadequate to the scale of what it was addressing, but sincere. He had learned to take it in that spirit. "Thank you," he said. "I want to offer you something," she said. "I know." He had been expecting it. People of means, when confronted with an unpayable debt, move toward transaction as a reflex. It was not cynicism to recognize this. It was simply the grammar of a certain kind of life. $50,000, she said. "For your daughter. For whatever you need." He looked at her. "No." She blinked. It was a small thing. A quarter-second adjustment. But it told him this was not a word she received often in contexts like this. "I'm not trying to insult you," she said. "I know you're not. Then help me understand." Ethan thought about how to say it accurately. He was not a man who talked at length about himself as a general rule, and this was a topic he had spent 3 years thinking about in the particular private way that people think about the things that define them without their consent. "When my wife died," he said, "I was on a job site in Akron. She was in a car accident on 71. It was a Tuesday in March. I got the call at 2 in the afternoon, and I drove back and she was already gone." He paused. "For a while after that, I couldn't do the work, the structural work. I'd look at a load-bearing calculation and there was just nothing there, no connection between me and what the numbers meant." He looked out the window again. "I found other work. Work that was physical and cold and required me to be present in a way that didn't involve calculation. And I brought my daughter home and I did that work and we got through." He turned back to her. "Last night I saw a bridge that was going to fail, and I saw a car on that bridge. That's all I saw. If I'd thought about money before I moved, I wouldn't have moved. So money isn't the right language for it." Claire Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Outside, one of her men had moved to the side of the road. and was looking at his phone. A crow landed on the power line above the truck. Ethan watched it settle its feathers. "All right," she said finally. "Not money." Her voice had changed again. Something had gone out of it that had been professional formality, and what was left was more direct and slightly less certain, which he found he respected more. Then, what would be the right language? He didn't have an answer for that. He told her so. It was at that moment that the front door of his house opened and Lily appeared on the porch. She had gotten home from school on the bus. He'd forgotten the time, and she was standing in her coat and her backpack, looking at the cars with the direct, evaluating attention that 8-year-olds bring to phenomena that fall outside their established categories. "Dad," she called. "Why are there so many black cars?" Ethan got out of the Suburban. "Come inside, Lily." "I'll be in a minute." But Lily had already registered the woman in the car. The way children register adults who are different in some quality they can't yet name. She lifted her chin and looked at Claire with the frank assessment of someone who has not yet learned to pretend she's not looking. Claire looked back. Something moved across her face, something that had nothing to do with boardrooms or infrastructure funds or the clean, controlled environments she apparently inhabited. She looked like a person seeing something she hadn't expected to see. She came back 4 days later. This time there were no Suburbans. She drove herself, in a dark green Volvo that was considerably less conspicuous than the fleet she'd arrived with before. She knocked on the door at 10 in the morning, which was when she'd determined, through some research he didn't ask about, that Lily would be at school and he would be home. He made coffee. She sat at his kitchen table in the same direct way she sat everywhere, spine straight, hands arranged, taking in the room with the careful attention of someone who processed space the way Ethan processed structures. He watched her look at the shelf of engineering textbooks he hadn't opened in 3 years but hadn't been able to put in boxes either. He watched her look at Lily's drawings, pinned above the radiator, a horse with improbably large eyes, a rendering of their street in winter that had an architectural accuracy, suggesting Lily had spent more time at this window than he'd fully appreciated. He watched her look at the old photograph on the sill above the sink, Rebecca, in a yellow sweater, summer, laughing at something outside the frame. She looked at all of it, and she didn't look away from any of it, which he found unusual in people who came from money. Money often trained people to look past the evidence of difficulty, to treat it as a kind of static that could be tuned out in favor of the signal. Claire Whitmore looked at his house the way she had presumably looked at structural assessments throughout her career, taking in what was actually there rather than what was convenient. "I've been doing more research," she said. "I assumed. The Greer-Halton project on the Route 30 overpass. The report you filed before you left the firm." She set a folder on the table, thin, no more than 20 pages. "I had our people pull the original, the one that recommended closure. The firm overwrote it." "I know. And the overpass stayed open for 2 more years and then failed in 2020. And 3 people were injured, and a vehicle was lost." She was watching him carefully. "You'd left the firm by then, 6 months before. Because of the overpass, among other reasons." She was quiet for a moment. He refilled both cups, though she'd barely touched hers. Outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder he'd put up for Lily last winter, an absurd red signal in all that gray. He watched it, briefly. "I also pulled the Milford assessment," she said. "The pedestrian bridge. You recommended closure, and the municipality agreed, and they did a full replacement. The engineering contractor who did the replacement cited your original assessment in their project report as exceptional structural diagnosis under limited inspection conditions." She paused. "That phrase is not common in infrastructure reports. I've read a great many of them." He said nothing. "You're very good at this," she said. "You know that." "I was. You are." No give in her voice. No softening, no diplomatic cushioning. What you did on the Dunmore Street Bridge 4 nights ago, reading a live failure event in real time, making the correct extraction path decision under those conditions, getting us both clear with perhaps 15 seconds to spare, that was not instinct. That was competence. A specific, trained, practiced competence. The kind that doesn't go away because someone stops using it for a few years. She paused again, letting that settle. "I don't believe it goes away. I've been in business long enough to know the difference between a skill that's dormant and a skill that's gone. Ethan sat with his coffee. The pellet stove ticked. The Cardinal ate and flew. Whitmore Capital has 18 infrastructure projects in active assessment across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, she said. Bridges, overpasses, tunnels, drainage structures, most of them municipal, most of them underfunded, most of them aging out of their design envelopes faster than anyone is acknowledging publicly. We fund the assessments and, when the numbers support it, the remediations. We need people who can do what you do. She looked at him across the table with the directness she brought to everything. I'm not offering you charity, Ethan. I'm offering you a job, one that needs doing by someone who can do it. I have a job. You have 2 jobs that pay for a life. I'm offering you work that matters to you. I think those are different things, and I think you know they are. He looked at the textbooks on the shelf. He looked at Lily's drawings. He looked at the photograph in the window, Rebecca, at an angle that suggested she'd been turning to say something, the laughter just ahead of the words, her whole face moving towards something. Why? He said. She understood the question, which was not really about motivation but about sincerity. Was this the reflexive problem-solving of someone with resources? Or was it something she actually believed in? Because you ran toward a bridge that was failing, she said. Because you knew exactly what you were running toward, and you ran anyway. Because when I offered you money, you said no, and I've spent 4 days thinking about that, and I still find it instructive. The faintest movement at the corner of her mouth, controlled, private. And because the work matters, and you're the right person for it. Sometimes, it's that simple. And the Route 30, overpass, he said. You know the history. You know I lost my job over a report. I know you filed an accurate report, and your firm buried it for commercial reasons. That's not a disqualification. That's a recommendation. He looked at her. She looked back. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove. What are the terms? He said. The terms were fair, more than fair, if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be even when it was inconvenient. Senior Infrastructure Assessment Consultant, reporting to Whitmore Capital's project director in Columbus. Travel would be required 2 or 3 days a week in the field during active assessment seasons, the rest remote from wherever he chose to base himself. The pay was more than he'd made in his last year at Greer Halton. Health benefits, which he hadn't had in 3 years, and which he thought about with a particular feeling he recognized as shame at how long he'd let that slide, and a condition he hadn't asked for but that she offered anyway. Harlow Creek would be his base. He would not be required to relocate. The town needs someone in this region who understands regional infrastructure, she said. Half our Ohio projects are within 60 miles of here. It's not a concession. It's practical. He suspected it was both. He didn't say so. He sat with it for 2 days. He drove his route on the first day and thought about it while the plow blade moved snow and the salt spreader did its work, and the town slept around him in the cold. He did mechanic work on the second morning and thought about it with his hands inside someone else's engine, finding the problem by feel. Both kinds of work had served him. Both kinds of thinking had served him. He did not discount what the past 3 years had given him. But he also did not pretend that they had given him everything he needed. He called his old colleague Marcus Webb on the second afternoon. Marcus was still working in infrastructure consulting in Cincinnati, still at the same desk he'd had when they'd both been starting out, and he listened to Ethan's account of the past week with the silence of a man taking careful notes. "Are you seriously asking me if you should go back to the work you were born to do?" Marcus said, when Ethan had finished. "I suppose I am." Ethan, a pause with real feeling in it. "Come on." He sat with it for one more day. On Thursday evening, Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table long division, which she was approaching with the pragmatic determination she brought to obstacles generally when he sat down across from her. She looked up from her worksheet with the unsurprised expression of a child who has learned that important conversations often begin with adults sitting down in an unusual way. "I have a job offer," he said. She put down her pencil. "What kind?" "Engineering. The kind I used to do. Looking at bridges and overpasses and figuring out if they're safe. Writing the reports about what needs to be fixed." She processed this with the focused quiet she brought to things that mattered. "Like the one that fell down?" "Yes. Trying to find them before they fall down." "Is that why you knew it was falling?" "The bridge. Yes. Because you studied them. For a long time, yes. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something had resolved itself satisfactorily in her internal accounting. Then you should do it, she said. Because other people might need you to know that, like she did. She picked up her pencil. Then, without looking up, can we still stay here? Yes. Okay. She returned to her long division. Then, is it the ladies' company? The one from the black cars? He smiled despite himself. Yes. She seemed okay. He called Claire the next morning. He said yes. She said good. In the precise, undemonstrative way she said most things. Then, departing briefly from the professional register, I think this will be worth it. Said simply, directly, with a quality of sincerity that wasn't about the work at all. Or wasn't only about the work. He found he had nothing to argue with in that. He started the first week of February. His first assignment was an overpass assessment in Steubenville, a state route bridge that had been flagged in a routine inspection as potentially compromised in its deck joinery. He drove out on a cold Monday morning with a set of fresh credentials restored through an expedited relicensure process that had taken 3 weeks, a new inspection kit, and the specific quality of alertness that comes with returning to a thing you've been away from too long and finding it waiting. He stood on the underside of that bridge for 4 hours. He read the structure with his hands and his instruments, and the reconstituted fluency of 8 years of practice, which had not gone anywhere. Which had been precisely where he'd left it. Dormant, but intact. The way a language learned young stays in the body, even through years of silence. He found 3 issues. The routine inspection had missed 2 and the deck joinery is flagged. 1 additional in the lower lateral bracing that was the more serious concern, and documented them with the precision that his old supervisor, Patricia Shen, had once told him was the rarest thing in their field. He filed the report that evening from the kitchen table in Harlow Creek. He and Claire spoke professionally for the first month. Emails, project updates, the occasional call when a site question required her input. She was precise and responsive and committed to the work in a way that was evident in every exchange. He was precise in return. It was a functional and respectful working relationship, which was what they had agreed on, and he did not complicate it. Then one Wednesday in mid-February, she called about the Steubenville findings, and at the end of the call, after the business was finished, she said, "How's Lily?" With the same directness she brought to everything, not as a social courtesy, but as a genuine question. He told her Lily was well. She was in a school play, a retelling of a folk story that had been significantly revised by the student cast and was accordingly no longer identifiable as any particular folk story. Lily was playing a character listed in the program as a very important owl. She had memorized her 4 lines, and 2 of the lines of the character who shared her scenes. Because she felt the other child needed backup, there was a brief sound on Claire's end of the line that might have been a suppressed laugh. Then, "She sounds like someone I'd want on my team." "She is," he said, and meant it in every sense. In March, the county hired Whitmore Capital to assess 6 structures within 40 miles of Harlow Creek, including the site of the Dunmore Street collapse. Ethan led the assessment team himself and 2 junior associates from the Columbus office, both of them recently licensed and very good. He worked well with young engineers. He remembered what it was to be young and credentialed and uncertain of the gap between what the textbooks had taught and what the field required. On the 3rd day of that project, he stood on the bank of the Black Fork and looked at the truncated concrete abutments that had once anchored the Dunmore Street Bridge gray and blunt against the brown early spring water, the exposed rebar already beginning to surface rust in the thaw, and felt something he didn't immediately name. Not grief, not quite. More like the feeling of standing in the place where a sentence once ended, and recognizing that something new could begin there. Claire came out for the final site review at the end of March. She wore practical boots. He noted this with quiet satisfaction, and a wool coat that was still more elegant than strictly required for bridge inspection, but considerably more appropriate than the charcoal cashmere. January. They walked the South Bank together, while the junior associates measured and logged. She asked precise questions about the abutment condition and the creek hydrology. She had done her reading. He found this consistent with everything else about her. The new bridge, she said, looking at the truncated abutments. What's the recommendation? Steel truss replacement. Modern specifications. Full design life extension. Adequate clearance for the 100-year flood envelope. If we're building new, we build for the next century. Who designs it? He looked at the creek. High with snowmelt. Moving fast and brown and purposeful. Above the far bank, the bare trees were beginning to show the first suggestion of leaf out, just a thickening in the bud clusters, a deepening of color in the tips of the smallest branches. I will, he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression that was not professional, not the careful composure she maintained in working contexts, but something quieter and more direct. Good, she said. The Dunmore Street Bridge opened in the 3rd week of August. The county had a modest ceremony, the kind that small towns manage with genuine feeling and limited budget, a ribbon, a brief speech from the county commissioner who had, to his credit, made the new bridge a priority the moment the old one was gone, a local reporter photographing the ribbon cut from 3 angles, a scattering of residents who had come because they remembered the old bridge or because the story of the January night had traveled through Harlow Creek in the slow, thorough way that stories travel in places where everyone eventually knows everyone. The contractor who'd built the new bridge had framed the final design review and hung it in their office, which Ethan found approximately 1/3 embarrassing and 2/3 gratifying, which was, on reflection, about the right proportion. He stood near the south abutment with Claire while the ribbon was being managed. She had driven out again. This was the 3rd site in 2 months she'd attended in person, which was, by any reasonable project management standard, more than her role required, and which neither of them had remarked on. She stood beside him in the late summer morning with her hands in her coat pockets, watching the commissioner deliver his remarks, and the August light came at a low angle across the Black Fork and caught the new steel of the truss in a way that made it look briefly like something out of an older time, the 19th century, when bridges were built to outlast the people who imagined them. It's good, she said quietly. It'll hold 100 years. That's not what I meant. He looked at her. She was watching the ceremony, not him. Her profile in the morning light was composed and still, the quality of stillness he'd come to recognize as her most honest state, the version of her that existed when she wasn't managing anything, but simply allowed herself to be present in something worth being present in. He looked back at the bridge. He looked at the water moving below it, fast and clean, indifferent in the way water always is to the human structures built over it. The creek had been there before the bridge and would be there long after any bridge they built. The trusses caught the light and held it. 70 tons of engineered steel doing the work it was designed to do. It would keep doing that work in January storms and August droughts and every season in between. For 100 years, for people who hadn't yet been born. 3 yards away, Lily was standing with Marcus Webb's daughter Clara, who had driven down from Cincinnati for the occasion and was 12, and therefore, in that specific adolescent zone of being simultaneously too old for some things and too young for others, which made her exactly the right age to be immediately fascinating to an 8-year-old. They were at the railing, looking down at the water. And Lily's voice carried to him on the light wind, not the words, just the tone. Animated, confident, fully herself. She was going to be fine. He had known this, on some level, even through the hardest years. She had her mother's instinct for what was fundamentally important. And she had something of her own, that he was still learning to name a quality of clear-eyed engagement with whatever was in front of her, without flinching, without pretending things were other than what they were. It was, he thought, a good way to move through the world. But she was also going to be more than fine. That was the other part, the part he'd been careful not to want too directly, because wanting things directly had cost him before, and the habit of caution was hard to unlearn. A school with a strong science program in Columbus. For next year the commute was workable, and the school had a bridge building competition in the spring robotics fair that Lily had read about 3 times online, and casually mentioned twice as though it had just occurred to her, each time. A father who was doing the work he'd been trained to do, which meant he was more fully himself, which was a different thing than just being present. He thought about Rebecca. He thought about her in the way he'd learned to think about her, not with avoidance, not with the debilitating weight of the early years, but with the specific, grateful clarity of someone who has lived long enough past grief to be able to hold what it left without being held by it. She would have thought the bridge was beautiful. She would have read the engineering report and asked good questions, and then said something that reframed his technical explanation as something about people, because that was the translation she'd always performed, effortlessly, between his way of understanding the world and the broader one. He was grateful for the years they'd had. He was grateful for Lily. He was grateful, in a way he was only recently learning to acknowledge, for this. "Thank you," he said. Claire glanced at him. A brief, precise acknowledgement. Nothing performed. "Thank you," she said. Matching his register exactly, which was characteristic, and which he had come to find more valuable than eloquence. Lily turned from the railing. Across the small crowd she found him with her eyes. She always found him. It was a skill she'd had since she was very small, this orientation, and lifted her hand. He raised one back. She turned again to something Clara was saying, already moving on, because 8 is the age when the next thing is always as important as the last thing, and this is not inconstancy but abundance. The creek moved below the new bridge, the way it always had. The trusses stood against the August sky, new and clean and built to last. That was enough. More than enough.